Most readers rush right past it. They are in a hurry to reach the famous climax, the poignant dialogue with three searching questions. Do you love me? Followed by the charge, feed my sheep. Yet to reach that powerful moment, they walk straight past a detail so delightfully ordinary that it barely registers on the page. Before any of the talking begins, the risen Son of God is crouched in the damp sand of a beach at dawn, building a small fire and cooking fish. Stop there for just a moment, because the scene is genuinely astonishing. This is the morning following the most cosmic, consequential event in human history. Death itself has just been defeated. The tomb stands empty. The person turning fish over the embers has, by his own word and theirs, conquered the grave. Yet what does he choose to do with his very first moments among his friends after rising from the dead? He doesn't summon them to a majestic mountaintop. He doesn't manifest in blinding supernatural glory. He doesn't deliver a grand theological lecture explaining what has just happened to the universe. Instead, he builds a fire, grills a few fish, warms some bread, and calls a crew of exhausted, embarrassed men over to eat breakfast. We are so familiar with this gospel story that its sheer strangeness slips right past us. But if you had been asked to predict how the risen Lord would spend his first recorded morning, making breakfast would never have made the list. It feels too humble, too domestic, more like something your grandmother would do than something the triumphant conqueror of death would do, which is precisely why we must stop and look closer. John, the author of this account, never wastes ink. He is the most intentional, deliberate wordsmith of all the gospel writers. When he lingers on a fire, a few fish, and a warm meal, he isn't just filling space before the real scene begins. The breakfast is the real scene, and hidden within a single, specific word he uses to describe that fire lies a subtle detail that transforms this quiet morning from a quaint domestic footnote into one of the most profoundly tender things Jesus ever did. Let's walk down to the shoreline together. To appreciate the emotional weight of this morning, you have to understand what these men had just endured, and why they were on that beach in the first place. It is a few days after the resurrection. Peter, the bold disciple who had once sworn he would die before denying his Lord, only to disown him 3 separate times before the rooster finished crowing, abruptly announces, "I'm going fishing." The others decide to join him. It is easy to misread this as a casual outing, but it was far from casual. Fishing was Peter's old life, the world he knew before Jesus called him. It was a familiar trade, something he could control, a comfortable fallback for when everything else had shattered into pieces. There is a quiet, tragic resignation in his choice. The man who had walked on water and been called the Rock is back in the boat, gripping the old nets, retreating into his former identity, as if the last 3 incredible years had simply washed away into the sand. And to make matters worse, the fishing fails completely. They labor all through the dark hours of the night, the prime time for catching fish, and haul up nothing. At dawn, their nets remain completely empty on the very same lake where their journey with Jesus first began. The symbolism is inescapable. Returning to his old life doesn't even work anymore. Peter couldn't maintain his faith on the night of Jesus' trial, and now he can't even catch a fish. Then, through the gray dawn light, a figure appears standing on the shore. The disciples don't recognize him at first. He calls out across the mist, asking if they have caught anything. No, they admit reluctantly. "Cast the net on the right side of the boat," he tells them. They obey, and instantly the net fills so heavily and suddenly that they can scarcely drag it behind them. John, who is always the first to perceive spiritual reality, whispers to Peter, "It is the Lord." At those words, Peter, who is nothing if not wholehearted, even in the midst of his deepest messes, throws himself into the cold water and swims frantically toward the shore, leaving the boat behind. Picture what he is swimming toward. He is paddling toward the very man he disowned, the face he last saw across a crowded, hostile courtyard. Peter has no idea what awaits him when his feet touch the sand. Will it be a stern reckoning, a bitter rebuke, a cold, painful silence? All he knows is that he cannot remain in that boat another second. And what is waiting for him when he drags his dripping, ashamed body onto the beach? A crackling fire and a warm breakfast. Notice this key detail before we even get to the specific word that changes everything. When the disciples reach the shore, the fire is already burning. The fish are already sizzling over the coals. The bread is already prepared. Jesus does ask them to bring a few of the fish they just caught, folding their labor into the meal. That in itself is a quiet act of kindness, allowing them to contribute to a breakfast that didn't actually need their help, but the meal was already prepared. Jesus didn't wait for their success. He didn't need their catch. Before they had landed a single fish, before Peter could offer a word of explanation or apology, the food was ready and the fire was lit. The provision came first, and it came entirely from him. There is a breathtaking picture of God's character folded into that small moment. He fed them before they produced anything. Their strength had failed all night. Their professional competence had yielded nothing, yet none of their failure altered what was waiting for them on the beach. The fire was not a reward for a successful catch. It was lit long before they arrived. Grace almost always arrives in that exact order, prepared before you are ready, burning bright before you have earned the warmth. Now we come to the detail where John does something most readers miss entirely, hidden in the precise Greek word he selects to describe the fire. John uses the specific word, anthrakia. It refers explicitly to a fire of burning coals, a charcoal fire. It is the root of our modern word, anthracite, the hard coal that burns long, low, and hot. This word, anthrakia, is exceptionally rare. In the entire New Testament, across all 27 books, it appears exactly twice. Once right here on this beach, at this morning breakfast, and once earlier in this very same gospel, penned by the exact same hand. In John chapter 18, on the dark night when Jesus was arrested, Peter stands in the chilly courtyard of the high priest, anxious to see what will happen to his master. Because it is cold, he huddles with the guards and servants, warming his hands over a fire. John takes special care to tell us what kind of fire it was, a charcoal fire, an anthrakia. And it was while standing in the glow and heat of that specific charcoal fire that Peter was asked 3 times if he knew Jesus, and 3 times he swore he did not. 2 charcoal fires, the only 2 in the entire New Testament. One in a courtyard where Peter disowned his closest friend. One on a beach where the risen Jesus is about to ask Peter 3 times if he loves him. This subtle linguistic bridge was intentionally placed there by the one gospel writer who was standing close enough on both nights to remember the exact smell. Because that is what a charcoal fire produces. Beyond light and heat, it carries a very specific, unmistakable scent. The deep, smoky aroma of low-burning coals. And of all human senses, smell is the most powerfully linked to memory. It bypasses logical thought and instantly transports you right back into a moment you wished you could forget forever. When Peter dragged himself out of the water and caught the scent of those burning coals on the morning breeze, a part of his soul was immediately standing back in that courtyard. He was reliving the absolute worst moment of his life, watching his courage shatter. Jesus reconstructed that fire on purpose. He deliberately recreated the exact sensory environment of Peter's deepest failure, and then he cooked breakfast over it. At first glance, our human instinct might flinch at this. It can feel almost cruel on the surface, rebuilding the scene of a man's deepest shame and making him stand in it again. But watch what Jesus actually does within this recreated setting, because it is the absolute opposite of cruelty. He doesn't bring up the denial. He doesn't replay Peter's failure, lecture him, or demand a dramatic apology. Instead, he asks a simple question, 3 distinct times, one for each denial. Do you love me? And with every genuine yes that Peter utters, Jesus hands him back a piece of his lost calling. Feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. The man who disowned his loyalty 3 times beside a charcoal fire is given 3 opportunities to declare his love beside another charcoal fire. He is not merely forgiven, he is fully recommissioned, entrusted once again with the care of Christ's flock. This reveals something magnificent about how Jesus heals us, and it is worth lingering over, because it runs counter to all our natural instincts. He doesn't heal Peter by helping him avoid the memory. He doesn't move the moment of restoration to a safe, neutral location free of uncomfortable associations. Instead, he walks Peter straight back into the exact physical setting of his defeat. The same smell, the same low glow, the same early morning chill, and redeems it from the inside out. He doesn't erase the courtyard. He builds a second fire, and gives the memory a brand new ending. There is a depth of mercy in this that a simple verbal pardon could never achieve. After that morning, the smell of a charcoal fire would never again belong exclusively to the worst night of Peter's life. From that day forward, it would belong just as much to the dawn when his Lord made him breakfast and restored his soul. A scent that had once been an open wound was intentionally transformed into a monument of healing. That isn't accomplished by trying to forget the past. It happens when you return to the place of your pain with the right person by your side. If we step back from the fire itself and consider the simple act of the meal, we see a pattern far older than this shoreline. Whenever God moves to restore his people throughout Scripture, he repeatedly does so through food. This beach breakfast was no isolated incident. Look back through the biblical narrative, and you will continually find God meeting wandering, weary people at tables in the wilderness. He didn't lecture a hungry, faithless nation into trusting him in the desert. He rained down bread from heaven every morning, manna sufficient for each day. On the night before his crucifixion, when Jesus wanted to give his disciples something tangible to hold on to in the coming dark, he didn't write them an abstract creed. He broke bread, handed them a cup, and said, "Remember me with this." And just days before this seaside breakfast, on the road to Emmaus, two heartbroken disciples walked for miles alongside the risen Christ without recognizing him. The exact moment their eyes were opened was when he sat at their table, took bread, blessed it, and broke it. As Luke records, he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. There is something about a shared meal that God continually returns to, as though table fellowship carries a spiritual weight that mere words cannot convey. A meal is not an argument, it is an invitation to intimacy. It declares without a single word that the distance has been closed, that you are welcome at the table, and that no matter what has transpired, we are sitting down to break bread together. When the risen Lord grills fish on a quiet shore, he is engaging in the most characteristic work of God, feeding those he loves with his own hands. That is the reality that should never lose its wonder. This is the very person John introduced at the beginning of his gospel as the eternal Word, the cosmic creator through whom all things came to be. This is the one who, just a few mornings prior, walked out of a sealed tomb under his own divine power. Every human expectation would anticipate distance, majestic ceremony, and unapproachable glory. Yet here he is, crouched low in the sand, carefully turning fish so they don't burn, warming bread, performing the quiet, unglamorous task of preparing a meal for tired fishermen. The hands that spoke the oceans into existence are now grilling fish caught out of those very waters. We often assume that true greatness holds itself above menial tasks, that the exalted have servants for such labor. But the risen Christ, at the absolute peak of his ultimate victory, gets down in the dirt and cooks. It is the same radical, downward movement that echoes through his entire life. The God who washes muddy feet, who lies in a feeding trough at birth, who rides into Jerusalem on a borrowed donkey, now appearing on a beach enveloped in wood smoke. His glory has never been the kind that demands to be served. It has always been the kind that kneels beside a fire and says, "Come and eat." Now, to be completely fair and thoughtful, a careful reader might ask, can we be absolutely certain that the charcoal fire was meant to explicitly recall Peter's denial? Strictly speaking, no, and it is important to be honest about that. John never explicitly states, "And Peter remembered the other fire." He leaves the connection unsaid. One could argue that the repeated word is merely a coincidence, that charcoal was simply the common fuel of the day, and that we are building a massive theological theory on a single vocabulary choice. Here, however, is the solid ground beneath this interpretation. The word anthrakia genuinely appears only twice in the entire New Testament text. Both instances are found in John's Gospel, and both feature Peter standing beside the embers. That is an indisputable textual fact. Furthermore, John is famous among the Gospel writers for his careful choice of words, his love of subtle symbolism, deliberate echoes, and layered meanings. An extraordinarily rare word, repeated by a meticulous author across two crucial scenes involving the exact same man and the exact same themes of denial and restoration. That is a literary pattern worthy of our trust. Even if John, in his characteristic restraint, prefers to let the reader feel the weight of the detail rather than spelling it out, the echo is undeniably real. But recognizing where text ends and thoughtful reflection begins is essential to reading Scripture well. Yet the breakfast itself requires no complex interpretation at all. That part sits plainly on the page. The risen Lord cooked a meal for his struggling friends. When we step off that beach, we realize this story carries our own name. Most of us, when we have failed miserably, crave one thing above all else: distance. We want to put as much space as possible between ourselves and our embarrassment, ensuring we never have to smell that particular smoke again. We try to rebuild our lives in places where the memory cannot reach us, quietly assuming that God desires the exact same thing, that the road back to Him requires enough time and distance for our shame to fade. We brace ourselves for a harsh confrontation, a cold accounting of our faults. Yet the shoreline tells a profoundly different story. It reveals that the risen Christ does not restore you by helping you run away from your worst failures. He restores you by meeting you directly within them. He lights a fire on the very ground of your deepest shame. And instead of an interrogation, He offers a meal. Instead of asking the dread-filled question, "How could you do that?" He asks a completely different question: "Do you love me?" And every time you whisper a heartfelt yes, He hands you back the purpose and calling you thought you had lost forever. You and I are in this story, like Peter, wet, ashamed, swimming toward the one we let down, bracing ourselves for the worst, only to find a meal prepared by His own hands, resting on a fire that was lit before we ever arrived. You do not have to earn your way back to His table. The food was ready long before your net came up empty. He isn't standing on the shore with crossed arms, waiting to see if you are remorseful enough. He is crouched over the glowing embers, gently asking if you'd like something to eat. Notice that truth one final time. The fire was already burning. That is where our ultimate comfort lies. Your restoration was fully prepared before you ever swam ashore, before you performed, before you got a single thing right. You are not asked to build the fire. You are simply invited to come and sit at the one that is already lit. The smallest, most domestic detail of the resurrection narrative turns out to be its most breathtaking revelation of grace. The Lord of Life spent His first morning back preparing breakfast for the men who abandoned Him, intentionally reconstructing the scene of their deepest defeat so He could fill it with new meaning and offer a fresh start. He did not summon Peter to an intimidating throne. He invited him to a humble table. That is still how He comes to us today. Not merely at the scene of your great successes where you expect Him, but at the exact location of your failure where you least anticipate His presence. With a fire already burning, a meal prepared, and a place reserved for you before you ever swam ashore. Come and have breakfast. If this reflection brought new light to your morning, share in the comments what you used to picture when thinking of the risen Jesus. Consider passing this along to someone who has been running hard from the smell of an old fire, and may the God who meets you at the place of your deepest fear keep you warm at His table today.